Welcome to the debut episode of the Collect and Destroy podcast. I am your host, the Baxter of Puppets. On this week's podcast, we're coming out of the gates, all guns blazing, talking all things Iron Maiden. Undeniably, one of the greatest heavy metal bands of all time. I'm joined today by our special guest and fellow metalhead, Ken Hoffman. Ken resides just outside Sacramento, California, and is a longtime friend of mine and concert travel partner. Ken and I actually met in Las Vegas several years ago, both working for a very large retail marketing company. And it was our love of metal and music in general that brought us together to really forge our friendship. Ken Hoffman, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Baxter. I'm psyched to be here, man. I've been looking forward to this for a long time.
Ken, I know you are not much of a toy collector, but you have a very specific and a very impressive collection. You want to tell me a little bit about that to get us going?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I collect skulls. I collect skull art. So it's like skull sculptures, skull figurines, skull drawings. There are some toys in there. You know, there's a lot of artists who sculpt things and then have them created in vinyl or replicated in plastic and whatnot. So there's some crossover in there. But for the most part, I just really keep to that symbol of the skull. And it's a lot of fun. It's kind of a cool thing to collect because it's universal. It's timeless. You know, every culture has a skull in it in some look or feel. So I've been collecting it for a while, and it's really grown over the last decade or so.
So what kind of when you are looking into like collecting skulls, what kind of things are you looking for? What type of skulls?
You know, I just kind of let it. I don't look for anything in particular. Usually the skull, because it's such a finite object, it's usually some sort of representation of an actual skull, like a miniature of it or actual size or some sort of physical specimen of it. So usually I'm looking for something that like sits on a shelf, really because I don't have any wall space left, although I will collect cool prints or cool sketches or cool paintings or whatnot. But you'll find a lot of carvings. You'll find a lot of, art that's made specifically to replicate the skull. So that's kind of what I gravitate to. But there isn't really one thing that I look for in particular. The only caveat I'd say is it's got to be unique. It's got to be cool, because there's a lot of junk out there, particularly with the crossover in Halloween. There's a lot of shitty skulls, a lot of cheesy skulls. So I try to steer away from that kind of stuff and just make something that I could be proud to show off and talk about.
Sure. What about human skulls?
It's always funny when I tell people I collect skulls, they kind of get a little wonky. They're like, really? I never collected human skulls. Although recently I was gifted 2 human skulls, so I guess now I do collect human skulls. It was never really intentional, and in fact I did get a gift about 8 years ago of a human skull, and I gave it back. I was like, this is how horror movies start. I'm like, you get this sort of artifact and it's haunted, and the next thing you know, your fucking house is possessed. So I returned it. And it wasn't even really a full skull. It was like a jaw mandible, and it was like the cranium of the skull, and I returned it. But recently, after years of collecting them, sort of my attitude has changed, and I also got some pretty cool ones. So now I've had them for probably about 6 months, and nothing freaky's happened. So I think I'm in the clear.
Very awesome.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun to collect. And what's cool about it too is that, like my family's into it too. So when we go on vacation, when we went to Mexico, we had a field day haggling with, all the local vendors over all their creations. There's a lot of Day of the Dead stuff. And really, because it's such a universal symbol, there's so much out there that it's you kind of come across them. Antique fairs are also a great place to find them. And the fun part is just when you discover them and you weren't looking for them.
So I would assume everybody is trying to buy you skulls.
A lot of people do. In fact, I've gotten a lot of really cool ones as gifts. I've also gotten a lot of really bad ones as gifts, but I think people in the know, like close friends of mine who know me, understand maybe like what my look is and what my aesthetic is, and they find stuff probably because they've seen my collection that's unique and they give it to me. Although at this point now I've got so many that I do get sort of, if it's not the same thing, very close to one. Like I've got a lot of chrome skulls and a lot of like black obsidian skulls. And, you know, I do have a big box up in the attic where it's just stuff that no longer makes the cut. Either it was cheesy from the beginning, or I've gotten so much of it now that it sort of comes off the shelf and, you know, gets replaced with something newer and more exciting to me because, you know, space is limited.
Yeah, definitely. I think I can definitely feel that with my own personal collection with all the toys. I'm constantly rearranging, reorganizing, acquiring new things, and some things just start to not make the cut and they end up in boxes. They're, you know, I have a closet full of stuff that's ready to sell for that reason. If you're always out looking for the coolest version of that item that you're looking for, like your skulls, eventually you have a collection of all the coolest stuff that you've acquired. And I think, yeah, some of the stuff that you might have thought was cool 5 years ago, as you elevate your collection and continue it, it just starts to not make the cut. It's not that it's not cool anymore.
Yeah.
It's not as cool.
You know, I always like when people come over, you know, they always kind of get a tour of the house and I bring them into my office and, you know, I'm always like, okay, I'm always sort of prepared for what they're going to say when they walk in. But usually they're kind of excited about it. But, you know, after usually a couple of drinks, I'll be like, hey, you know, I want you to pick out your favorite skull and sort of force them to dive into the collection a little bit deeper and see which ones speak to them. Because what's really fun about the collection is just the vast diversity of expression, artistic expression that comes out of it. Different colors, different materials, different expressions. You know, a lot of it comes from either music influence or there are specific artists that I've collected that now I have a different, you know, different samplings of their work. So I like to task my friends. I'm like, hey, or even strangers that come in, I'm like, which one speaks to you? Because then I get to sort of evaluate them psychologically. I'm like, okay, why did you pick that one? Is it because it's the prettiest or it's the girliest? Or did you like that one for, you know, a different reason? And what's also fun about it is just the size discrepancies. I've got really large ones, but then I also have, you know, my minis, which, you know, you get down to like the size of dice or even smaller. So it's a really fun thing to be able to share with people and interact with people.
I know outside of the skulls, you're also a book collector, right?
I do. I mean, I've got, you know, my books on my bookshelf or the collection that I've had are the notable books that I've enjoyed reading and felt moved me in some way over the course of my life. But specifically, I collect Stephen King hardcover books. He's been with me like my whole life. I started reading him, you know, when I was 8 or something like that, really, really early. My uncle lived in Maine. I was exposed to him early. I was always interested in the macabre and horror movies and metal, and it all crossed over. And it's been fun to be able to have one author in your life consistently. You know, go back and reread a book you haven't read in 20 years. Do you still feel the same way about that? And what I think is cool about that is that's sort of the same conversation that you can have about listening to music. So when you were like, hey, you want to do this podcast about Maiden, all things Maiden, I've been listening to Maiden for, you know, 30 years. I've been reading Stephen King for 30 years, over 30 years. So that, you know, that synergy and that correlation are just things that really sort of fire me up. You know, now the world's a little bit easier because of eBay. You know, you can buy, you know, I'm basically like 3 or 4 books shy of having the entire collection complete.
Beautiful.
I don't go after first editions because I don't have the money for that, you know, because especially now with his popularity and the amount of, you know, the amount of books that he's written have been adapted to movies, it's virtually impossible to go after all that stuff. So I just like to have one in my bookcase and I'm good. You know,
what totally unrelated but related. What's your favorite Stephen King book?
Christine is up there. The Dark Half is up there. I like some of his short story books is actually my best. I think some of his best works are when they're really short and concise, because I think he has a tendency to like over character develop. He can go on and on and on. 1,400 pages for the unabridged stand is like ridiculous. But you know, different seasons and Night Shift. Actually, Night Shift is probably my favorite collection of short stories. And a lot of those short stories have gotten developed into like big movies. The Green Mile, Rita Hayworth, and The Shawshank Redemption. All those were just Stephen King short stories.
Yeah, his content is just made to be made into movies, and they keep making better versions. And when you mentioned The Stand, I'm currently chronologically reading all the books. So I'm at The Stand right now, reading the unabridged 1,400 page version. I'm about 400 pages into it, and what I find, I'm at awe of his writing ability. But living in New England now for almost 3 years, everything has like an even more of a meaning now, like because I feel like I'm living in the atmosphere of all of his stories. So I'm really, really enjoying that journey.
What made you choose to read them in order?
I feel like because I waited so long to dive in, and I'm a completionist. So anything I do, whether it's a movie series or it's buying toys, I always feel like I need the whole set. So I'm also currently watching all of the James Bond films in chronological order before Bond 25 comes out. So that's 24 films I've got to watch before. Well, November was when it was supposed to come out. We'll see. But so you watch all these things throughout your life, and different points in your life, different ages, some when I was just little. So now rewatching them all in chronological order, I can kind of experience it the way that they were released to the public. See the evolution of the character. And for Stephen King, you see the evolution of the writing.
Sure.
And I think that it seems like anyways that his earliest work all the way through maybe the early 90s is probably some of his strongest, most popular, well-known written pieces.
Well, what's interesting about that, he's pretty candid about his life. If you read any of his autobiographical stuff, he'll tell you like the early years were like super coke induced. Like he was young, he was staying up all night and doing blow all evening. And when he goes back and rereads his stuff, he's like, oh, that's just trash. I think he's very critical of his own work. A lot of it though is really popular, is still some of his best stuff. So there's certainly a journey that he went on as a writer, struggling with his addictions, which show up like literally and sort of metaphorically in all of his novels. It's a sort of a recurring theme. So that's an interesting. Now I'm reading his books chronologically because I'm all caught up. But I'll go back and reread a book just to sort of see if it moves me in the same way. Like when it came out as a new movie again, I went back and reread it. And I wasn't really as taken with it the second time as I was when I read it when I was like 14. So I found that sort of an interesting observation.
Sure. Yeah. It's always interesting to see, like, is it better than you remember? Is it lesser than you remember? Is it the same as you remember? And I think anytime you first experience it, I think you experience it much stronger than a second time through. But I mean, age does affect that as well. How you may have been, where you may have been in your life, or even I can think of so many books that I read as a child that like I didn't pick up on a lot of the context or message in the book.
Right.
Because I was a kid. So I'm reading it for face value of what it is when they're really talking about something much larger.
The same thing goes for music too. Like when you listen to an album for the first time when you're like young and impressionable, and it hits you in a way that may or may not stay with you forever, and sort of prepping for this podcast, when you and I started to talk about it initially, I was like, all right, well, I'm going to go back and listen to Maiden. And I listened to him chronologically, which is not how I was exposed to the band,
Sure.
But, I'm sure we'll dive into it as we talk over the next few. But I made some observations about the albums that I hadn't realized before. And I think that's just age, as you get older in life and you look back on those sort of nostalgic things that you experienced, whether it's a book or music or a movie you saw or an event you saw, you have an idea about them and you have this sort of memory. But then when you break it down and analyze it, do you still feel the same way X amount of years later? Sometimes the answer is yes. And sometimes the answer is not. And, that's what was funny about King. I think books, or anyways, Stephen King in particular, because he's really the only author that I really have dove this deep into ever.
Sure.
When I reread his books, some of them just don't hit me like when I listen to an album again. Music is a different experience than a book is. But then there are other books too. When I read them, I'm like, man, that is still my favorite to this day. So I think that's really kind of what's fun about that journey, is that rediscovery and that reanalysis all those years later,
So I think that's a good segue, talking about re-listening to some of these albums and digging in when you first experienced them. So when did you first experience Iron Maiden? Like what do you remember where you first saw them or heard about them? Just tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah. I'm going to age myself on this, but I grew up in, the 80s. I mean, I'm 45. I was born in 75. So, I was an MTV kid, and, music was just not nearly as widespread with all the channels that they have now. So when I was in seventh grade, which was 1988, a friend of mine came up to me. I know, dude. He said, "You need to do this." And I was like, "What's that?" He gives me this catalog, and it's the Columbia House mail order catalog. So for those who are not in the know, before there was like Amazon and e-commerce or the internet, a lot of companies sold product through mail order. And Columbia House, which was a big record company, then it was cassettes. CDs weren't out yet. I had some vinyl, but not a lot. It was all about cassettes. They had the tape. They had like a tape club, and their intro was, for a penny, you could get 10 or 11 tapes for 1 cent. And then the fine print was they were setting you up to get recurring shipments every month that you had to pay for or ship them back. They kind of, that's the hook. But, a 10-year-old kid doesn't know that. All I saw was 10 tapes for a penny. And I was like, oh, I'm in. And there was some things that I was aware of because of MTV that I picked. But then there was a couple things that, I had some leftovers and I didn't really know what to choose. And a couple of my friends who had older brothers were like, these are the tapes that you need to get. And that really set off my metal journey. Master of Puppets, Randy Rhoads tribute, Iron Maiden, Life After Death, Death, Leprosy, and then there was like Men at Work and Hall Notes or whatever. I don't remember what the remember were, but I do remember it was Master of Puppets, Randy Rhoads tribute, and Life After Death, and that was a game changer for me. Up to that point, I mean, I was a metalhead out of the womb. It seems like I remember that Twisted Sister and Quiet Riot and Rat were my bands very, very early on, but that was because I think MTV introduced me to them. There was videos for them, and Dee Snider was like super vocal and super larger than life. But Metallica never had videos at that time. Maiden didn't have videos at that time. Ozzy may or may not have, but I didn't know that. And then I got those tapes, and my life changed, man. That was it.
Yeah, I personally, this isn't how I discovered Maiden, but for me, it was BMG Music Group, not cassettes, but it was CDs.
Yeah.
And the same thing, it was like, I would listen to stuff, or I picked stuff because I knew I was supposed to. Like, of course, I heard some of these bands on the local radio and stuff like that. But like, I could think of like Stone Temple Pilots, Marilyn Manson, Smells Like Children, White Zombie, Astro Creep 2000. These were things that I checked that little box or put the little sticker on. I think there were stickers at that time. Yeah, you're right though. It was kind of like a scam because then they would just send you a CD for $20 every month. And I remember actually at one point I just wrote return to sender and put it back in the mailbox, and then they stopped showing up because they're trying to get you to buy all these records. But it's amazing how many random blind picks I picked back then when I was a kid that I still listen to this day, and they're
Yeah.
still some of my favorite records.
Yeah.
And I've been fortunate.
The album cover.
Yeah, it's like the album cover is a big part of it. The band's name is a big part of it. And some of them, like, I didn't know what they sounded like at all, but I was like, I know I'm supposed to like this, not because like necessarily anybody else. It's just like a sixth sense kind of a thing where you just like, and that same thing with like Maiden. It was like I got into Maiden late in the game, probably like mid to late 90s, early 2000s. But I knew I as like a hardcore kid who loved metal and everything metal that I should listen to Iron Maiden. And I would, there was like a Russian website I would use, and it was weird because you paid for this Russian website. It was paid. It wasn't like like just pirating, which I also may or may not have done a bit of.
Loved it. Yeah, man.
But you could get full discographies of bands, like the full discography. You download album by album, and I would always start. I'd be like, I don't want the singles. I want to start. Again, this goes back to the Stephen King discussion, but I want to start with their first album and see what they're all about. And then I'll figure out what my version of this band is as I get into their discography. So, I mean, I started with the self-titled album. I started with Killers. I didn't even realize that was a different singer. Like, I just thought it was, I see pictures of Bruce Dickinson. I hear this guy's voice. I just assumed it was the same guy.
Yeah, well, I got Live After Death first, which was a live album. It was Dickinson. You know, there was no internet at the time. There was like getting information was really hard. So I didn't even realize that there was another singer, like you just said, for a long time. So I first got through the albums that really had songs on Live After Death. And then I don't even really remember when it was I discovered that Paul Di'Anno was another singer that originated the band, and that there were other members that song sometime. Because it always seemed to me that like Dickinson was the guy. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, how could there be anybody else before him? How could this band have two successful albums before him? It just didn't make sense to me. But did you ever did you complete the did you honor your contract with that CD club?
I think I did, because I think I had to buy only however many, but then they kept sending the stuff. I don't recall. I didn't, nothing ever happened from it. So I don't know, but
I remember clear as day when it showed up on the doorstep. Came in like a brown box that was just large enough to fit 10 tapes in. And my mother was like, "What's that?" And I was like, "I don't know. Somebody must have played a joke on me and sent me all these amazing metal tapes." And I don't know what happened. She must have either called the company and paid it off, or I should ask her. She never gave me shit, and I never found out really what happened. But you know, I denied that I knew what was happening. But she let me keep them. In fact, I kept them in that box for a while, because that was like really that was the cornerstone of my collection. So I didn't have like the cool cassette holder yet. So I kept them in that brown box for, you know, as long as, you know, the collection grew, and eventually got something cooler to hold everything in. But yeah, that's how it all started. That's how it all kicked off. And I remember it so vividly. You know, Master of Puppets, such instrumental album. Live After Death just set me down the Maiden trail. And then, you know, Ozzy, Randy Rhoads tribute, what got me into him. Solo first, before then I went back and got into Sabbath way more so than I ever got into Ozzy. But, you know, that was the origin of my introduction to Maiden.
Yeah, I think another memorable moment for me was again, this is probably early 2000s. I'm going over to, it was kind of like a party at a friend of a friend's house. Like, we went over, there was like 3 or 4 of us. You know how you would get in a car and you just end up at somebody's house. It's you know, like a Saturday afternoon. We go over to this friend of a friend's house. We're all hanging out. We're in their basement. And on the TV is the Iron Maiden, the early days DVD set, which the first discs I think are just like live concerts. So you got Paul Di'Anno live concert, then you've got like live at the Hammersmith Odeum, and I'm sitting there and I just end up hanging out with the kid's dad. Like I'm sitting there talking to the kid's dad about Iron Maiden for like 2 hours straight. Because that was my best option at that moment of like what I could be doing. And this guy was super into Maiden and I was super into Maiden as well. So just again, like a early memory of like really, that's what really opened my eyes to like the Paul era versus the Bruce era. And like, that image is burned in my mind of like, I had never seen them live at that point, but, all right. So, moving on. All right. That sound, ladies and gentlemen, means it's time for the ranking. Today, Ken and I will be ranking each of our top 5 Iron Maiden studio albums. I'll run through my list, 5 through 1, followed by yours, Ken. And then the debate and discussion shall commence, starting with our number 1s and moving backwards. So, Ken, you haven't even seen my list yet. So
I haven't.
Let's get in it. There's a lot of overlap here. At number 5, I have Seventh Son of a Seventh Son. Number 4, Power Slave. Number 3, Peace of Mind. Number 2, the self-titled debut, Iron Maiden. And number 1, The Number of the Beast.
All right. Okay. So we've got the top 3, same. And then you've got Seventh Son in there over Somewhere in Time.
Correct, Mundo.
Yeah. This was like a fun task. Like it also kind of difficult to do. I think that I chose sort of the sexy answer for Number of the Beast, but I'll tell you how I sort of came to my conclusion on ranking this. I went through and listened to every album chronologically, which I'd never done before for Maiden.
Sure.
Certainly was not how I was introduced to Maiden. And I took notes on each album about really, which songs stood out to me. There's the obvious songs on each album, but like which ones were the ones that were maybe things that I heard a little bit differently years later, I sort of had the reanalysis. But then also I had to incorporate the first time I heard the album. So this is not necessarily like the ranking of what I think their best albums are, but maybe a ranking of what I think are my favorite albums. So there's a difference. And you and I never really qualified this when we said, hey, let's do a top 5. So it was sort of open for interpretation. But Live After Death, and then The Number of the Beast was really their first album that I got into. I remember the video for Run to the Hills was like the black and white movies all like edited together, and it's the sexy pick. It's also like the evil album, and like as a young metalhead, when you see that you're attracted to things you're not supposed to be. The album cover, the Number of the Beast, and like, oh, Satan worshiping. I'm like, fucking, I'm in, man. This is awesome. But then Hallowed Be Thy Name has to be up there in like the top 5 best Maiden songs of all time, which is really the reason why I'm like, okay, I have to give it the number 1 for sort of all of those reasons combined.
Yeah, I mean, Gangland is probably the only non-single on that album. And I don't know if it's because like, a lot of albums, if you listen to them enough, you feel like they're all singles.
Yeah.
But that album is stacked. I think that's the only song that I can think of that I wouldn't, when I was going through my top 5 here, I was looking at each album as, like the undeniable singles that everyone knows and loves. Then I was looking at like, what are my favorite songs? So that might not be a single, but a song I like. And then lastly, well, like just how many of those songs are featured on the album, and it kind of made sense as the discography went on. Those numbers got less and less, and yeah, I
Well,
mean, number of the beast is undeniably a top 10 heavy metal album of all time. Like
sure.
if somebody came to you and said, "What is heavy metal?" you're gonna give them Number of the Beast as one of those albums.
Without a doubt. And then you also have to give Dickinson credit for what he accomplished in his first record with the band, is that Maiden was already on to great things with Di'Anno. Like, I think Killers debuted at #1 in the UK. These guys had a following already. He came in, seamlessly transitioned. Like, his vocals, if you told me like that singer was the same singer, I'd be like, okay, I almost believe you, because
Sure,
of
sure.
how Di'Anno's vocals sort of progress between Maiden and Killers. But then Number of the Beast comes on. There's a lot of similarities. It's almost like, that operatic theatrical singing that Dickinson was sort of famous for was also in Di'Anno's vocals. I think he's a little more punky,
Yeah.
but Killers is certainly an album where it starts to get more flow to it. And Number of the Beast, I think, naturally, it progresses naturally into that. But then he just took it to a level that they're superstars. And think about, like, if you had to come in and replace somebody like that, that's a lot of pressure to do. So as a debut single, or as a debut record for that singer, I think that's also has to be, a part of the reason why this is the #1 album. This is the reason why I ranked it. But then also, like, musically too, each of those albums, you can sort of see them now like they've identified their signature sound, and Number of the Beast is their signature sound that they kind of stuck with, the dunk dunk dunk, like that, just sort of like rolling train they got. They really established it on that album and forever really stuck with it. So that formula was there. That was the origins of the formula, I think.
Yeah, there was really nothing like it before it. Like, there's been a lot of things that maybe try to emulate that sound, and even like they followed that same format then throughout their careers. But like the foresight of a talented singer like Bruce Dickinson, who was in Samson, and he's an amazing singer in a not amazing band.
Yeah.
And then you have this amazing band in Iron Maiden who have yet stepped to that next level of songwriting. They know what they want to do, but they haven't gotten to that level yet, which the Number of the Beast was that next level of songwriting. And then you enter Bruce Dickinson with this amazing theatrical operatic singing.
Yeah.
And then the look, I mean, just the look of the band and the look of Bruce and the long straight hair with the bangs, like
right.
That amazing. Just it still gets me excited when I see that stuff. And I something that I would recommend to anybody listening that is just getting into Maiden or wants to know more about Number of the Beast is to check out the Eagle Entertainment does a whole series of like 1 hour documentaries, and each one is on a specific album by a specific band. So they did one on Iron Maiden's Number of the Beast, and it's 1 hour, and they break down each song, and they even like go to the soundboard, and here's just Bruce's isolated vocals. There's the story behind the songs, and also the story behind the band of where they were at in their careers, what led them to that point at the album, and then the impact of the album had. So, I mean, unrelated to Maiden, I've watched this for bands that I don't like, and it's made me more of a fan of the band.
Mm-hmm.
I've also seen episodes where it made me just like still despise the band. But if you love a band,
I still don't appreciate anything that you do.
yeah. If you're a fan of the band and you watch something like this, your mind explodes the more you know. Anything else on the Number of the Beast before we move on?
I mean, the artwork was a big part of it. But I mean, all Maiden artwork is a big part of it, and I know that we're going to dive into that a little bit deeper probably later. So, yeah, no, I think it's a good pick. And I think that I bet you I mean, I don't know, but I think if you ask the majority of Maiden fans what their favorite album is, I bet you this would be the winner.
Here's why you don't pick the Number of the Beast. You don't pick the Number of the Beast because you've heard it 10 million times.
That's true. Yeah.
Like,
if I'm tired of anything, it is Run to the Hills, you know?
It's why it's hard to listen to like the Black Album, because it's oversaturated and been played a million times. As every year that passes, it gets a little bit easier to go back and listen to it because it's not all over the radio. There's new Metallica, there's new stuff. But when an album like The Number of the Beast, I've heard it so many times that it's probably not the album I throw on, even though it's my number one pick and it's the best album.
Right.
It's the same thing with Rain in Blood for me with Slayer. Like, I can't listen to Rain in Blood because I've listened to it too many times. That doesn't mean it isn't a top 3 album by Slayer, if not number 1, but that's another podcast.
Right.
Speaking of the artwork, though, for The Number of the Beast, I just wanted to mention, I'm always, as part of Collect and Destroy, I'm also a collector of vinyl records. So I post pictures of vinyl records that I have in my collection. Number of the Beast was one recently in the last month I posted, and I try to like kind of dig in a little bit, some fun facts about the albums. And one of the things I found interesting was that the sky of the album on the LP should have been black, like the previous 2 albums. The Self-Titled and Killers, it was a black sky, black background. Number of the Beast should have also been a black background, but there was a printing error, and it turned out to be a blue sky. Which actually, when I look at them side by side, I like the blue sky. But that was actually a printing error, and I didn't know that until recently.
Yeah, I think that's pretty common, actually. I've got a book on Derekk Riggs where he talks into like where the creation of his art and the reproduction of it. A lot of that happened more often than you think that influenced the outcome of it. Bad reproduction or low cost. Like, he would design in 2 colors for certain things because they couldn't afford to print more than that. So he used like black and yellow on Killers primarily because of that. So when you find the history of that kind of stuff, you know, as art geeks like you and I are, that's always cool information to find out. So yeah, that's a fun little anecdote.
All right, moving on. Number 2, we also had the same pick here. Self-titled Iron Maiden came out in 1980 out of the gates with Paul Di'Anno as the singer, who we know as the singer for the first 2 albums.
Well, I want to hear your thoughts first on why you think number 2.
My first thoughts are, well, there's the generic answer that we've probably heard a lot, which is bands spend their whole life writing their debut record, and that was shown on that album, how much it just rocked coming out of the gates. For me, that album is it's not unlike Kill 'Em All, where it has this feeling, and it's almost like this punk hardcore feeling to it, where it's like it's us against the world. The Number of the Beast doesn't have that feeling. It's like that's like a bigger, more epic thing. But on the self-titled debut, it's like, we're here, we're together. I love watching the videos of them playing the small clubs, playing those songs. The production is perfect. Like, that's the kind of production I can crank in my car, and I just want to drive fast. Running Free, there's 2 reasons why this is the number 1 pick. The 2 reasons for me are Running Free and Iron Maiden by Iron Maiden on the album Iron Maiden. And when I hear the song Iron Maiden and I see them in concert and they play that is quintessential Iron Maiden to me. That opening riff. Oh man,
It's interesting that you say like bands spend their whole career writing their debut album. I think the only person in the band the whole time was Steve Harris. So like the first album, Steve Harris is the only guy in the band that's also in Number of the Beast. Maybe Dave Murray. I don't know if Dave Murray was playing guitar on those first 2 albums, but
yeah, he was
the guy who's like, okay, so it's 2 guys. So you got the guitar, you got Dave and Steve are the only 2 that are consistent between those 2 things. Especially like Maiden through those first 2 albums and just getting to a point before they started recording, there was a new fucking guy in there. It seems like every 10 minutes, you know?
Yeah.
So that's an interesting thing. I've never really taken. I mean, I've been in some bands over the years that were for fun, but I've never taken it ever really seriously, where we were trying to like write stuff to get a record. So I don't really know the struggles of it. But you know, watching all the Maiden documentaries, it's very clear that they were like they all felt that Number of the Beast was the first time that it clicked finally, like in every area.
Sure.
And even then, Nico McBrain was still not on drums at that point yet either, I don't think. Or maybe he came out for that album.
He came out. No, Clive Burr was on drums, but
Yeah,
Nico joined right. He joined right after, so he was on that tour, but not on the album.
So, but actually, when I was diving through this and using sort of like my notes and all of my ideas to rank them, I almost put self-titled Iron Maiden as the number one album.
Sure, yeah.
I almost put it, but then I was like, okay, I have to think that the reason why I'm putting Number of the Beast 1 is because it was really the first album that I got into with love after I was introduced to them, plus the evil of the album and the sort of the aura of it. But
yeah,
the way that you said about the song Iron Maiden, I feel the same way about the Prowler.
Okay, so, okay.
Like for a long time, or you know, when I think it was Metallica was either my first or second concert ever. I get them confused. It was the same year. I saw the Ramones and then I saw Metallica in '88. And then Kirk Hammett would come out on stage, and it was a Damaged Justice tour. And he would play this riff for like 5 seconds. And he would just go, wow, 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 wow. And I was like, what is that? It was so cool. And it was just a snapshot. And I had a bootleg of that concert on VHS. And I remember playing that riff over and over and over. And it took me forever to figure out who that was. When I discovered, I don't know how much longer, that it was the Prowler off of Iron Maiden's first album. Fucking boom! That instantly became like my favorite Maiden song ever. That's like, it just, I you know, it's these funny things that you remember about certain things in your life. That was certainly it. But that track, I think that whole record really start to finish as a debut record is fucking killer, man. The Phantom of the Opera, dude, the center of that song when he breaks down.
Yeah.
It's like, keep your distance, walk away. Like, oh, dude, it's fucking awesome. So
his Paul's phrasing, like the phrasing on that record. Again, thinking about the Prowler, the way he comes in, I agree. I also had the Prowler highlighted when I went through, you know, as that was the third song from this album that I had highlighted. But yeah, when he comes in, he's got just that swagger and that attitude, and I kind of like that his style visually was a little bit different than the rest of the guys in the band. Like he embraced that vibe. Like I don't know where they end up if he would have stayed the singer. Like, do they end up being like Motorhead, like that level? Not the sound, but like Motorhead undeniably is a huge band, but they weren't doing arenas and stadiums like the way that Iron Maiden does.
Right.
So I think that maybe they fall more in that range where they're still a globally recognized act with Paul as the singer, but I don't want to overshadow this album by talking about what Bruce brought to the band, but as a debut, and I think we've talked about this before, but and usually it was comparing the Iron Maiden we know with the later years Iron Maiden, but you can also say the same thing with the first two albums. That could almost be viewed as a different band, because the style is different. Like the vibe, I would listen to a band like that had 10 albums, even though that was just a short-lived portion of this career.
That middle album that shows you if Iron Maiden and Number of the Beast had a baby, it certainly is going to be Killers, because the guitar is starting to go that way, and even the vocals are starting to go that way. Like that's why I feel that Dickinson really was the best addition to that band, because he took down sort of the groundwork of what Di'Anno was doing and just ramped it up. Like Di'Anno, I think, doesn't get enough credit for sort of the operatic theatrical singing that he was capable of doing. he's definitely more punky. His look was definitely more punky, but I think he had a pretty fluid, harmonized singing quality to him. Certainly more so in Killers than on Iron Maiden, but that's probably the reason why I like Iron Maiden is because it's gritty, it's dirty, it sounds like a album that came out in 1980,
Sure.
It's and Running Free, again, it's like they play that now to this day at every show. What a great fucking track. And the recording of that, the drums sound better on the recording version of that than they do live, for sure.
Yeah,
They can't capture that sound in the studio live because you don't get that sort of like banging on pots. You know what I mean? That's what it sounds like. It sounds very primal and primitive to me, and I love it.
Yeah, again, I would compare that album to Kill 'Em All, where it's like it's not the polished band we come to know and love, but the rawness of a band of dudes who probably had no money going and recording this record that is purely supported by fans. Like the only reason that they end up where they are is because it's so authentic that everyone buys in and buys those records, and it's undeniable. When bands have that thing, it's undeniable.
Sure.
All right. So let's keep this rolling. Again, we're synced up at our number 3 here. We both picked Power Slave. No, I mean we both picked Peace of Mind. Sorry.
I choose this as number 3 for 2 reasons. The Trooper, which is probably their biggest hit in my mind of all the popular songs, this is probably the best one, I think. But the chorus of Flight of Icarus might be my favorite vocals ever by Bruce Dickinson.
Sure.
And for that reason, boom, number 3.
Yeah. I mean, Where Eagles Dare, Flight of Icarus, Die With Your Boots On, The Trooper, Quest for Fire, Sun and Steel. I mean, I love all these songs.
Yeah.
I think Quest for Fire and Sun and Steel are probably the not as popular songs as, of course, like The Trooper. Like that's so well known. But yeah, it's interesting going back to have to actually rank these, and you discover it was the first 3 was really not that hard to put those 3 of Number of the Beast, Iron Maiden, and Peace of Mind. It's when I got to number 4 and number 5 which starts to get a little more tricky. Shall we dive into number 4, Power Slave for me, and Somewhere in Time for you?
Yeah.
Why Somewhere in Time?
Well, I think this one just has start to finish. It's a better collaboration of songs. Caught Somewhere in Time is a great song. You got Wasted Years, which is, maybe one of their best, but you end with Alexander the Great, which, my mom's family's Greek. So that's why I like Flight of Icarus and Alexander the Great were my 2 favorite songs. One was mythology and one was the history. And I was and fucking Maiden touches it all. And he sings about it, and he sings about it so beautifully. So, but I think when I look at, when I was breaking down, Power Slave and Somewhere in Time, you've got the hit on it. You've got Wasted Years on it. And then you've also got those other tracks that are just as equally as strong, which I think edge out Power Slave.
For me, I think Power Slave A is the best album artwork of all of the Maiden records.
Sure.
Maybe that's just my opinion, but I think when I see that just sings to me, seeing the Pharaoh Eddie Sphinx design. I mean, I have that tattooed on my leg. I have the Pharaoh Sphinx Eddie. Starting out with Aces High, 2 minutes till midnight. Power Slave, Rhyme with the Ancient Mariner. I mean, that's a long song, but you could see the growth of the band. I mean, it's only 1 year difference between Peace of Mind and Power Slave. So for me, it was obviously, and I mean, obviously that ranks very high for you because that's your number 5th pick.
Yeah. Basically for the same reasons. I just kept the artwork out of it because that's we could debate artwork of Maiden forever too. Power Slave comes in before Seventh Son for me. But again, I think the hits the hits were the reason why I ranked them the way that they did. While I think that Power Slave is a great song, and I think that 2 Minutes to Midnight's a great song, Aces High is great. Like, I think the artwork of Aces High, though, outshines the song.
Sure.
So that's why I ranked it the way I did. And although I do think that Power Slave is better than Seventh Son, though.
Sure.
So, yeah.
Well, up until probably a week ago, I probably would have put Killers in the 5th spot.
Yeah.
And again, it's just
really?
all the stuff that we said about Iron Maiden self-titled is why I think maybe, again, I'm influenced by having listened to so much Maiden. I think that those early albums just really resonate with me.
Yeah.
Seventh Son comes in because it's probably their most progressive album, the most proggy. Can I Play with Madness? Probably pretty poppy, but it just expanded the scope of the band overall. I mean, it's the last album with Adrian on it before his return.
Right.
Evil That Men Do, that's like a great chorus, and then the title track, Seventh Son of a Seventh Son.
Yeah.
I'm such a visual person that like the whole the concept, the artwork, everything tied together. The artwork for Seventh Son of a Seventh Son, that's probably my second favorite stage setup for Maiden. The first probably being the Power Slave setup, the whole Egyptian theme. Seventh Son is like the Arctic theme. When they went out on tour, I can't think of, trying to think of how many years ago that was.
I think it's 88.
8 years ago, though, they went out on another tour and they did the Seventh Son tour again, and they did it with the Arctic stage setup. And for those of you who don't know like the scope of how large the stage setups are for Maiden, I saw that tour at an amphitheater in Milwaukee, the Marcus Amphitheater, and they could only bring out 2/3 of their stage because it didn't fit on the stage because it was an older amphitheater. It's a big amphitheater, but Maiden's,
they're insane.
I mean, we could have a whole podcast just talking about their stage show and what they do and how they reinvest that into the band. Like you don't leave unhappy when you go to an Iron Maiden concert.
Dude, you didn't even mention the best song on Seventh Son, which is The Clairvoyant, I think.
Yes.
You know,
I think when you come to the 5th album here, a lot of it too for me was like, which is your favorite single? Like, because a lot of the albums are riding on one specific song, which is great when you do a retrospective tour and you're going to try to play something from every album.
Right.
Another band that is really good at that, a more modern band, is Korn, where they have like whole albums that are like, you do not need to listen to the album at all, but they've got like a killer single, and that killer single makes it into the set list. And when they play that song, everyone goes off. But I couldn't tell you another song on one of those albums.
Yeah.
All right, that sound means it's time to head into the pit. In this segment, we pit 2 or more things against each other in the ultimate fight to the death. In round 1 of this week's Into the Pit, we are pitting both of the Paul Di'Anno-fronted Maiden albums against each other. Iron Maiden's 1980 self-titled debut against their 1981 sophomore effort, Killers. We've already kind of touched on this a bit in our top 5. Ken, you want to take the platform? What would be your pick of these two? One's got to go.
This is so easy. The only thing better about Killers is the cover. That's it. The album artwork for Killers is fucking killer. But Iron Maiden's debut album by far blows away. Everything about it, all the tracks. I don't think there's a bad song on the first album. Second album, I feel like it's the B-side of the first album. And I think it was released pretty quickly afterwards. It's good. Wrathchild, best song on the album. But then after that, it's like, I'm not into it.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, Killers is a good song. Purgatory, Murders in the Rue Morgue.
Yeah, I mean, it's good. It's good, but it's no Maiden.
Obviously, Wrathchild. I think part of it too for me. So I also picked the self-titled I mean, that
Uh-huh.
was my number 2 pick as well.
Yeah.
Killers might have made my number 5 though, so that kind of can give you some insight
That's
to
what you
what
said.
I
I was
think about these. I
yeah.
think though, like you said, it does kind of feel like a B-side. It's almost like if they wrote 20 songs or 16 songs and then they just used 8 for the self-titled. They had 8 left over and they put them on Killers. That's kind of how it feels to me. So it's almost like when you really like a band and you really like an album, and then all of a sudden it's like, hey, we had all this unreleased music, and you dive into it because you're like, oh, there's more to Vulgar Display of Power. Oh my God, there's 8 more songs,
Right.
and they're 8 songs that they didn't deem good enough, maybe, but all of a sudden you have it at your fingertips, so you listen to it because you want more of it. So I mean, I like Killers. I like the album artwork. um Wrathchild for me, yeah, definitely the jam. I think with those early albums, here's really where it can give you some insight to what my opinion is about the early albums. When I go see them live, my favorite songs of the night is when they play anything from the first 2 albums.
Really.
So even though Bruce is singing them, but he does obviously he does justice, but they're just so raw and rock and roll.
Sure.
Um,
I, I, I like I like Killers. I'm not in love with Killers. I think though that we mentioned it earlier. To me, it's the middle album between Maiden and Beast, where they start to, it's a little bit more polished. It's a little bit more produced. The songs start to get a little bit more of that like sing-songiness, which becomes Maiden's, thing. The debut album is a little bit more. It's a little rougher, it's a little dirtier, and Killers is a little bit more polished. But I think it's an important album because it certainly starts to establish the tone of Maiden. I think, what's the instrumental on that? Genghis Khan, I think, is instrumental on there. I think that's a great track, but there's no vocals in it. It's just like, but you're starting to get sort of that quintessential Maiden sound that becomes their signature and that they've played for the next 40 years. So I think it's an important album, but I don't think it holds up when you have to choose between the two, which is unfortunate for me because I from an artwork perspective, I think this might be one of their best album covers. And when I see people who are wearing a Killers shirt, I'm like, you're a fucking poser, man, because you would know that's not their best album. I'm like, you're just wearing that because you want to be cool, wearing a fucking Maiden shirt. I always kind of want to quiz them on it, like who sang on that album, dude. But the artwork in this one too, that's one of the things I was reading. If you look at Eddie, he's mostly yellow and black, because they had issues and budget. They had budget issues. There is some other color in there, but he had to keep it down to like minimum amount of ink on that.
We know all about that.
We do. So I think that's really interesting that he designs these covers because of certain things like that.
Yeah, I think you can definitely tell where Steve, Dave, and Clive at that time, because Clive really is the drummer on Number of the Beast. Like you can tell where they're headed. You can also tell why they would have made a decision. I know there were some other issues with Paul outside of his actual performances. So you can tell that they had a vision. Steve Harris had a vision. So there's some weird things like on Killers where you're kind of like, what direction are they going to head in? Are they going to go a Def Leppard route? Are they Prodigal Son oddly has a solo Ozzy vibe when it starts.
And it gets a little like trippy too. It's kind of goes off into the clouds for a little bit and then comes back down. So they're experimenting, I think, with sound a little bit. And that happens later on too. Like Maiden certainly has its, I don't know if I would call it a softer side, but a little bit, you know what I mean? It does get more melodic.
They're not afraid. They're not afraid to mellow out. Like you can tell that there is no part of them that's worried about what people are going to think. They're like, we are badass no matter if we're playing this melodic part or whatever. We're going to rock your socks off. Mm-hmm. And that's that. All right. In round 2 of this week's Into the Pit, Paul isn't getting off so easy as we pit him against Iron Maiden's longest tenured singer, Bruce Dickinson, as well as Blaze Bayley, who was their singer from 94 to 99. So I think I already know who you're picking, but go.
Blaze who? I mean, I have no idea. I truthfully, I've never listened to the two Blaze Bailey records, so I can't discuss it. Does that make me a less Maiden fan, or does that just make me a pure Maiden fan? I don't know. That's for you.
In this process of preparing, I had realized, I couldn't even remember any songs by Blaze Bailey that I haven't seen performed live by Bruce. I mean, on the last tour, he performed 2 Blaze Bailey songs. When I went back to listen to those albums, I was actually surprised. It was weird because they almost felt like a different band, like trying to cover Iron Maiden or something. Like it didn't seem up to the level of Maiden. Like, and a lot of times when bands switch singers, they switch genres, but they were playing in the same genre. I don't know. It didn't sound right.
I think it's, I don't know how often it happens, but I'm going to say it seems like it's pretty rare that you can have a band that's successful with an initial singer for any certain length of time, replace that singer, and then have either equal or greater success. It's usually pretty rare for a frontman because that's usually sort of your identity. Maiden certainly was able to do that, but still honor, I think, what Di'Anno had started, but still also having a distinct flavor for each of those 2 singers. So I would give them a lot of credit. I think another band that's done that equally to the same level would be AC/DC. And, Van Halen, although is Sammy better than David Lee Roth? Probably not. I don't think so. So I don't think they're in that category. But like, if you asked me, I don't think it was until about 10 years ago, something like that, I had never listened to a Ronnie James Dio Black Sabbath song. So, because I was like, if it's not fucking Ozzy, it's not Sabbath. Finally, a friend of mine was like, okay, take the name away. Just listen to the music and tell me if it wasn't named Black Sabbath, would you like it? And I was like, and I listened to it and then I heard Heaven and Hell and I was like, okay, this is fucking killer,
Yeah.
Then I started to appreciate maybe you can have, a second life in this circumstance. Bruce was really, the guy, especially because when I was introduced to the band, I thought he was the only guy. I didn't know that there was a previous singer. So, unquestionably, it's Dickinson's band. It's really always been. But I do think that, just like AC/DC, like the sound continued, the sound continued for Maiden too. And Di'Anno, I think, was sort of a great building block in the foundation of the band because his vocal style, transitioned into Dickinson's, and it just seemed like it was the next evolution. So I wouldn't really say who's better, Bruce or Paul, because I think that they're equal. Also, you can't compare the catalogs either. You got 2 albums versus like, what does fucking Dickinson have? 14 or something, you know what I mean?
Sure.
So
yeah,
you can't really compare the career on that way. Instead, you have to sort of respect them in their time frame, like where in the history of the band and what do they contribute. And Di'Anno did contribute, man, like for sure. I think that his sound, his look, his lyrics, all great. Those first 2 albums, I think, are great from that perspective. So, but did it shift for me after Dickinson left and Blaze Bailey started? It did, because at that point I'm like, Iron Maiden's over. And then, I never really got back into Bruce on the second half, So maybe that's the nostalgia thing. Maybe you're just sort of holding on to that initial memory. But, that's kind of where I think on this one. So I wouldn't say that there's, one over the other, except for it really is Bruce's band at this point, though.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, if I'm going to pick one, I'm going to pick Bruce Dickinson. I think that you don't have Iron Maiden without Paul Di'Anno.
Yeah.
And as we both put his debut album as our number 2, like,
sure.
That has just as much to do with Paul as it does the other members of the band. There's no question in that. I think though that the most recognizable version is Bruce Dickinson's. I think that they don't have the longevity they did without someone like Bruce, who's super creative and always growing and changing, and such a personality, right? Like Bruce Dickinson can do anything. And I actually, to have a prop here, I have the Bruce Dickinson book. What does this button do? Great book, great read. You just realize how eccentric he is, and I mean that in like the coolest way possible. He is always like, I'm going to be a world-class fencer. I'm going to go fly commercial airplanes while singing in Iron Maiden. I'm going to go fly my band around and visit all these countries in South America and in Asia where no bands can play, but I can because I can fly my band there.
Right. I'm going to battle cancer now, like.
Yeah, exactly. And like, I know that you haven't followed the band in this like last leg of the band so much, but if you just ignore that they've been putting out albums since 2000, just ignore that fact. Their live show has not dwindled one bit. Like, there's only a few bands that I can think of. Like Anthrax is actually another band that has not dwindled. Like they are running. Scott Ian is running from side to side across that stage, giving everything. And when I see Yannick doing the exact same thing at his age, much older than the Anthrax guys, they're so energetic. Bruce is all over the stage. He's doing all sorts of wild stuff, shooting blowtorches off, and it gives you energy to realize like you don't have to be limited to your house. Like you can go out and do anything you want. They're not doing it because they're rich. Like it helps that they can be on that stage, but like they could do it much simpler, like a lot of bands are, where they go out on stage, they do Def Leppard. They go out on stage, they play a great show, but they're relying on the visuals of the video screens and stuff. They're not putting that energy into that athletic ability into their live performance. And does anyone not fill an arena because of that? No, people still go out and see those shows. But I think there's something very honorable to see somebody giving it their all. And when you're there, you feel like Bruce really is it. If you're in the back row, Bruce is singing to you. Like he's singing to every person in that amphitheater. So I've got to give the credit to Bruce. In terms of Blaze, I don't want to diminish like what he did, because what he did was he stepped into a long established band, did his best. I mean, he was a singer long before that. It wasn't like this was his first gig. He was in, I think Wolfsbane was the band he was in from the 80s. And those are big shoes to fill. And he filled them for those years from 94 to 99. He filled those shoes. And those albums aren't my thing, but I mean, who can say that they sang on an Iron Maiden album? Like he's got two to his name.
I wouldn't even apply for that job if I was Blaze Bayley. You know what I mean? Like fucking, hey, there's a job opening here. What is it? Oh, lead singer Iron Maiden. I was like, all right, I'm out. Thanks. I'm good.
So yeah, I think it's an interesting comparison. I think Bruce wins this one.
Yeah.
So another big part of this is the artwork of Iron Maiden, which is such an integral piece of the band, and has even swayed my top 5, because to me it is a concept, and I think we lose a lot of sight of that nowadays. The way music is presented, it's a lot less like internet visual, but it's not like you go to a store and you buy this thing that you're part of
through a bookcase of squares and find some piece of like visual porn that's like, shit, I got to buy this. I don't know what it is, but I got to buy it,
And it's your thing and your band and your people, and you have your identity by this. Just imagine 1984 Power Slave drops and you go in and you pick up this cool Egyptian looking record.
Yeah.
And then your band embarks on an 11-month tour through 28 countries. Embraces that visual theme.
I remember watching this video. It was like National Record Day or something that they had started a couple years ago. The intent for people to go out and buy local from small shops.
Yeah, record store day.
Record store day, yeah. And James Hetfield was being interviewed about. It was on that day, and they were like, "What are your memories from going to the record store? You know, when you were younger?" And he said, "My biggest memory was going and thumbing through the albums and picking up Iron Maiden, Iron Maiden." He said, "I didn't know what it was, but I saw that fucking album cover, and he's like, I had to pick it and take it home." Could you imagine if you're the lead singer of Metallica, or you will be the lead singer of Metallica, and that's your experience? You found Iron Maiden because of the record cover, and then you go home and the first thing you put on is the fucking Prowler. Boom. Of course you become Metallica. You know what I mean? Like that's just an awesome experience. And I think Maiden would not be Maiden without Derekk Riggs, without the fucking illustrator of all those albums. That's for sure.
Yeah, I think things are spoiled nowadays without having that kind of surprise of like seeing a cool band. The only way I can compare it is like downloading music randomly based on artwork, which I do. Like I'll be like, oh, this band has a sweet name and their album cover looks amazing. I'm going to check them out because there's nothing to lose here. I think we lose that a little bit nowadays we lose
it a lot because like imagery doesn't live forever anymore. Now it's like you're just scrolling through a fucking phone all day. You're like Instagram picture, video, next, more content. Come back the next day, give me new shit. You eat it, you digest it, you move on. Like this was a different time, a different era where like you had, I think it evolved from this. Like these images became a symbol of that band, became synonymous with the band. And I think that was revolutionary at the time because no other band really had a visual identity like this. Nobody had a mascot, if you will. And they created it. And it crossed over into horror movies, and it crossed over into comic books. And, when you're, 10, 12, however age you get exposed to that for the first time, boom, that's what you're into, man.
Hey, we got a listener question here from our buddy Nate Failhour. Why is Vic Rattlehead so much more highly regarded over Eddie? Who would win in head-to-head? Why is Nate wrong?
Yeah, exactly. I was like, he's definitely not more regarded than Eddie. In what way? Eddie reigns supreme in every iteration of conversation that goes. And head-to-head win what? Like a fight? Eddie's got hatchets and swords, and you know what I mean? Dude.
I think though that what like you were just saying about visual identity, a lot of bands picked up on the Eddie thing. Megadeth did have Vic Rattlehead. You've got the what was Anthrax's guy, the Not Man?
Yeah.
Not. And that one kind of fell a little flat, I think. Yeah. It doesn't have the same longevity as something like Vic Rattlehead would.
Mm-hmm.
But I think everybody kind of wanted to have that same kind of thing after the success of Eddie and seeing how impactful something like that is.
He was just the character, and the development of it was just really ahead of its time, because think about all the merchandise, whether it was intentional or not, all the merchandising opportunities that came out of that. You had posters. I want a t-shirt of this. I got it on my album cover. Eddie sort of started all that. And I think other bands then said, oh, well, shit, if Maiden's doing this, I can go this. They made more money selling merchandise back then, which is sort of common now today. Now that record sales doesn't make bands money, only live tours are. And even then, as far as I know, merchandise sales are really the big moneymaker for these guys. So if you have a recurring iconic thing that you can resonate with and see it evolve over different albums and have themes that relate to the content of the album, that's fucking killer.
Yeah, I mean, I think you do see this kind of like thematic visual thing applied to like groups nowadays.
Yeah.
I think a big difference though is that you're not seeing, when you see something like the Trooper anything with Eddie. At that time, you knew what kind of band that was. Like nowadays, you could see the Trooper Eddie, and you could be like, okay, is this like a SoundCloud rapper? Is this electronic dance music? Like, there's a lot of blurring lines of what kind of artwork is representative of what kind of genre. But I think at that time, it really was self-identifiable. Some of those things still carry over to this day, but um, I thought it was really interesting, that Derekk Riggs' involvement. So he comes in and he does the cover artwork for the self-titled album. And according to Derekk, that artwork was actually designed for a punk band
Yeah.
prior to meeting the Iron Maiden guys. So there's two things that happen. First, Iron Maiden has this mask that's on the stage next to their logo, and it's Eddie because he's an Ed, just an Ed. And so they create this iconic Eddie, and then Derekk comes in and applies that to this artwork. And he said that character came from a skull on I think a Vietnamese tank that he saw a picture of, that he inspired him to create the cover to the self-titled album. But just how that develops into this icon that to this day, you go to an Iron Maiden concert and there's 40 shirts on the wall and they all have Eddie on them.
Yeah, I love the incorporation of it into the stage setup. And I think a lot of bands sort of followed suit with that. I remember, I was exposed to Maiden because a friend recommended it to me. Although I was familiar with that artwork because we all were. It was just sort of like, what is that? Eventually, I probably would have discovered it on my own if it wasn't recommended. But I do remember going to the record store and thumbing through stuff, looking for something new. And I saw Grim Reaper, See You in Hell. And it was the same thing. There was a gruesome cover. I'm like, this band's name is Grim Reaper. I don't know anything about them. They've got to be heavy. And without Iron Maiden and Eddie, there'd be no Grim Reaper. It's obvious that these other bands that came after were picking up the template and saying, I got to do the same thing.
The legacy of the Iron Maiden art, the legacy of the beast, if you will, it's carried on now. One of my favorite artists currently is someone named Zombie Yeti, who's doing all this phenomenal artwork for pinball machines, as well as other artwork for bands, doing posters. He did the Primus pinball machine, Iron Maiden pinball machine, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Trying to think what else
That's like a niche. You're like a pinball machine artist.
Deadpool. Well, I think it's because he got in with Stern Pinball because they really liked his artwork, and they keep going back for more because he has this great developed style. What's cool though about his Iron Maiden artwork is it's very Derekk Riggs inspired. So it's almost like a like refreshed version of it, a little bit more cartoony, a little more. It's an obvious evolution from the Derekk Riggs stuff.
Well, Maiden, I think, actually even contracted Derekk Riggs. So after Killers or Number of the Beast or something like that, they locked him up, and he did like, I don't know, the next 10 or something like that, and lived off that. He still lives off of it today. I think he had some sort of falling out with the band later on. I don't know the specifics of, but he tours now. He tours things like comic book conventions and horror movie conventions. I went to a show in LA a couple of years ago called Monster Palooza, and it's basically like Comic-Con for horror movies, and it's rad. It's like all of the industry peeps who work for the big studios have a chance to set up a booth and like sell their own individual artwork. Sure. And Derekk Riggs was there. He had a booth, and it didn't say Iron Maiden. I don't think he's legally allowed to use the Maiden word, but you can't copyright Eddie. So I think that he, on his booth, he said Derekk Riggs, the creator of Eddie, and then had a big image of him. And I waited in line, and it really was not a long line at all, which, maybe I don't know why, because that was the first one. When I saw the listing, I was like, first place I'm going, Derekk Riggs. I waited in line for a short amount of time. you had to buy a picture, and he'll autograph for you. And it was like cheap. It was like, I think the smallest one that you could buy was like a $10 postcard, and he'd sign it for you. But you could get a whole slew of prints and things. So I bought a piece. I waited online, and I just went up to him, and I had a chance to say to him something that, like, I've been thinking. Never did I think that I'd meet the artist of like the greatest covers of all times. But that's exactly what I said to him. I went up to him and I said, Derekk, I'm sure that you've heard this a million times, but I got to tell you again, your artwork has inspired me on so many different levels, on how I create my artwork, on how I see and like other artwork, like what I think is the bar. Like, if you're not doing this level of work, then you're not good. You've inspired me on so many levels. You've inspired a million other kids on so many levels, but I truly believe that Maiden would not be the band, would not have the success that they'd have without your artwork. So, I thanked him for him, and I said, and thank you for being available to the public and not being an asshole. He was like the kind of dude you would definitely meet at a pub, and he would definitely have a 2-hour conversation with you while you're down to beers. You know what I mean? Chill, down to earth, and accessible. And I really appreciated that. And it was like the highlight of my weekend.
Yeah, I've had his book on my Amazon wish list for a while. Like, his art is just one of my favorite things. And I know you actually had gotten me a signed print by him as well. Yeah. I don't think it was Monsterpalooza. I think it was a different time, but
right.
Incredible. And a living legend that's still around. The last artist that I wanted to just mention in this, I mean, we could talk all day about the artwork of Iron Maiden, but Mark Wilkinson is another phenomenal artist. He did the latest album's art, the Book of Souls. He had previously done Live at Donington, the Best of the B-Sides, the Wicker Man art, which is pretty well known, as well as some other killer albums. He's worked with Fugazi. He did the phenomenal Ram It Down Judas Priest art.
Oh yeah.
And my personal favorite Judas Priest albums art as well, Painkiller.
That's funny. That's my favorite Priest album too.
Copycat.
Our top 5 is going to cross over for a lot of bands. But the artwork on that's great. But if you had told me that this Book of Souls art was Derekk Riggs, I would have been like, oh yeah, he's returned, because it looks very, very much like a Derekk Riggs piece, sort of it's like sort of the evolution of it. Which I think would be hard to do, to emulate as an artist when you want to bring your own flavor, but you have a brand like Maiden and say, hey, I need you to replicate this look and feel, because that's us. I wonder if it's an ego shot for him to say, yeah, I'll do it. Or if he's like, fucking just pay me and I'll do it,
Well, I would venture a guess. It's almost like a record producer who comes in to try to emulate their favorite producer, where it's like, okay, we're going to try to do Master of Puppets style production for a new Metallica album. I don't think it's below any producer to try to emulate a great production. And the same thing with artwork is, I would guess that Mark comes in and they say, hey, we want to do something that's in line with some of the Derekk Riggs stuff. I'm sure he's honored to be talked about in the same conversation, the same podcast, to be held in high regard as somebody equally worth mentioning.
Yeah, depending on Mark's age, he might be like a huge fanboy of Derekk Riggs.
Yeah, exactly. I've as a graphic designer, I've often, if I've been compared to anybody or something, mentions like, oh, it looks like this, or it feels like this. Like, that's a huge honor to hear that, because I don't ever hold myself in that same level. Or musically, as a musician too, you get your new record done, I give it to a friend and they say, oh, this sounds like blank and blank band. I'm like, really? You hear that? Oh my God, that means the world to me, because I would love to be mentioned sounds like this band.
Sure.
So, I mean, as we talk about the artwork, I think the next obvious connection is into toys, video games, and as I mentioned, pinball a little bit. Mm-hmm. The translation when it comes to heavy metal into the toy industry is a no-brainer, especially when you have such an icon like Eddie it's a no-brainer how you can make that translation into plastic figures.
Yeah,
I can
the
go ahead.
the crossover is just, I mean, it's so easy here, you know. I think you sent me one of these. You sent me the Power Slave one.
Yep, that's before I knew it wasn't it wasn't that high on your list. So
Well, I'm not a toy collector, so I got excited because it was an Iron Maiden toy, and I kind of knew that they were out there, but I didn't know how many were out there. And I debated. I was like, do I put this, keep it in its packaging, and put it up on my shelf of cool shit, which is like getting smaller and smaller. I'm like, or do I give it to my 4-year-old and let him play with it and be like, you know what? So, and then he kind of saw it and he was like, can I have that? And I made the decision for me. But I was like, do you keep this as a collectible or do you keep it as like a usable toy? Yeah.
yeah, I mean, like for me, I've talked about this before. I think the coolest thing with these Super 7 reaction figures is the style of the figure is very akin to like the 1970s Kenner Star Wars figures. So
Yeah.
not like a lot of hyper detail to the figure, but I love the artwork on the package. So for me on these, the Iron Maiden ones in specific, because it's got the killer Derekk Riggs artwork.
Yeah.
I mean, where can you get the Flight of Icarus? The single has been developed into an action figure. So not even just an album. The album stuff is cool, but the 7 inches that Maiden were putting out, the artwork on there was just as phenomenal.
Yeah.
So to get that in a new pop culture form of these action figures, Super 7 and Brian Flynn are just killing it over there with their interpretations of this kind of stuff. They did a lot of like other music related, like Gorilla Biscuits figures, stuff like that. Like it just, again, the translation from these iconic characters that are only associated with music into a collectible figure is amazing.
Are there other bands in Super 7 that have toy lines like that?
They just released an Ultimates King Diamond figure.
That seems a cartoon character, man.
One of the San Diego Comic-Con exclusives this year, I believe it sold out, was a Ghost.
Yeah.
It was a Ghost reaction figure.
Yeah.
It was actually the one that it comes with a saxophone, the new sax solo on the new album.
I'm not into Ghost, man. I'm sure there's probably a Kiss line too, because I'm like trying to think about who's theatrical and who has a visual interest that could translate.
I do.
It is a rare thing to be able to do that,
Yeah, I mean, if you look at like Kiss, they had the Kiss Migos in the 70s, the big figures. I've got a few of those. And they are doing a different brand, not Super 7, is doing something very comparable where they're like the retro action figures for Kiss. You can buy them at Target right now, actually.
Oh, really?
But they're doing like a different version for each tour. So like every tour era of Kiss, they had like slightly different costumes and stuff. So to see those in action figure form, you can lose yourself in trying to collect them all.
Yeah, just Kiss collectibles alone is a huge thing.
Oh, it's so good. I would check out online on Instagram. Knights in Satan's Service is an Instagram. That is John Five's Kiss collectibles page.
Oh, really?
So he's doing what I'm doing with Collect and Destroy, but he's doing only Kiss.
Wow.
And it's imports from all over the world. So you're like, okay, this is the tour program from Australia from 1976, or here's some handmade playing cards from Indonesia from 72. Like it's just weird, really cool stuff, like all sorts of collectibles. I don't know where he keeps that stuff, but
well, he's a dude who's got the ability to like make a building just for his collection.
Yeah, exactly.
My office and my studio,
I always find it inspirational when people well, and like for me, like John Five, he's like me. He doesn't drink, he doesn't do drugs. His vices are like me. It's collecting ridiculous, superfluous things. Mm-hmm. So it's fun to see a rock star not blowing their money on drugs and
on toy.
Yeah, just blow it on plastic, man. So another great company that's doing really cool things with Iron Maiden figures is NECA.
Yeah.
The Power Slave. I just got this one. the Power Slave, Eddie. I like the fabric on these is cool. So the Trooper, like those are fabric clothes.
Mm-hmm.
The chains on Eddie, the Peace of Mind, those are real chains, a cloth straitjacket. Like it just adds to the textural environment of those figures.
I'm familiar with NECA because I follow some horror movie stuff.
Sure.
And I think NECA's made like a whole line of horror stuff. Like there's
Yep.
Leatherface and Hellraiser shit. And, you can get down the wormhole of the internet. And I'm like, oh, I need to buy that. And then I'm like, no, I can't just buy more stuff because it's cool and put it on the shelf. I'm like,
you can.
I know. Okay, let me say, I won't because I'm like, I already do it with skulls and I already do it with,
Sure, yeah.
books and and then I like vehicles, you know what I mean? So I got other toys in the garage. I'm like,
Yep.
it's all about the scale, but I think the world that we live in now is way more exciting for kids than when we were little because art has had a revolution of awareness over the last couple decades where exposure to good artists have gotten more mainstream. Rogue artists like Todd McFarlane have put their stamp on the toy industry and, changed from that. You mentioned that sort of Star Wars Kenner look, which actually that's why I like the Super 7 Maiden stuff because it's just sort of stiff and I'm like reminds me of my old
no real articulation.
But the McFarlane lines that came out when he started to hyper detail everything, that really translates to all the Maiden stuff really well. So there's a lot of outside of just these two manufacturers, I've seen a lot of like Maiden sculptures where somebody has created, a replication of the Trooper in 3D and then cast this thing and
sure
molded it and casted, pieces like that. Monsterpalooza is great for that, man. All these studios that go out, all these amazing artists who work for studios then sort of do their own thing. A lot of them are just toy geeks too. They make cool shit. They figure out a way to manufacture it. You can now with the technology, you can do low runs of stuff. So you can like sample it out, see if it sells before you become like the next McFarlane Toys.
Yeah, I think limited edition is one of the biggest things right now going on in the toy industry, and collectibles in general, statues, whatever.
Yeah.
I think there's less of a need to do 1,000 of something. Like you just do 200.
Yeah.
And when 200 are gone, you do a variant and you do different color, different paint, different whatever, different packaging. I think that's largely where it's keeping the industry afloat too, because especially right now when people aren't going out to the stores as much. And what I don't remember things being like that when I was a kid. I remember going to the store and the shelves are stocked and we would buy the toys that we like. We'd buy the He-Man or the Ninja Turtles or whatever that we liked and we're out of there. And now I'm becoming very aware of how the exclusivity of the releases, and there's release dates, and people go into the store and they're scalping these releases and selling them for double the price because there's such a limited quantity.
Well, also it's because technology has advanced that it allows smaller companies with not a lot of money to make limited things at small runs. Back in the day, you had to be a big company. You had to have huge equipment. You had to mass produce things, and you could only sell it to everybody. So there was like 3 or 4 toy manufacturers, and they had everything,
Yep.
And they used to bid over the rights of, certain characters or names. Or like, they'd fight over who was going to get the movie rights, that kind of stuff. Now with, 3D printing and technology, like the CAD technology that's just evolved, that everyone can sit in their studio at home and just design shit and figure out a way to make it and figure out a way to sell it to somebody, or I'll self-fund this, I'll make it my own. So the industry has evolved because technology has evolved, but also our attention span has shortened as a result of it because of the technology and the Instagrams and the constant barrage of a million shit at you. Nobody's interested in like one thing anymore. Like me, I'm not interested in one thing anymore. I'm like, let me try that. I'll take a bite of that. Let's try this. And that's a good thing. sometimes it's a bad thing, but when you look at it in this perspective, it gives small players an opportunity to do stuff. That's a great art movement, and that's exactly what it is. It's an art movement.
Another area that Iron Maiden has gotten into in the recent years is there's actually an Iron Maiden video game, Legacy of the Beast. I've not played it. I think both of us can attest to liking video games, but not having time for it. And I think,
not a gamer.
I think that comes from like being project people. We're always on to some sort of project.
Oh, I'd rather exercise too. I mean, you got to fit that in your day somehow. You know what I mean? So
yeah.
What's Legacy of the Beast? Is that like an Xbox? This shows a pinball machine, but is it Xbox or?
I think it's an online game.
Okay.
I'll clarify on the website so people.
Are you Eddie and you have to like run around and kill shit? Because that'd be kind of...
I'll post a link on the Collect and Destroy, the social medias and the website so that people can check it out more. Because I'm not completely knowing where they went with that, but the evolution of that game, Legacy of the Beast, was the pinball machine, which again is by Stern Pinball and ties back to Zombie Yeti. So Zombie Yeti designs this great Iron Maiden artwork with multiple different headers with different themes. So I mean, I was just at a pinball arcade a few months ago, which was weird in these times because you got to be masked and whatnot, but they had this machine and it was just really cool. Like the evolution of pinball machines alone is Stern's got something going on here with their pinball machines. So it was cool to check it out. Obviously it's playing all your favorite Iron Maiden songs. So it just, the connection between music and pinball machines is incredible. And it's just like the toys and pinball, toys and music, and then toys and pinball makes a lot of sense.
If you had to pick one, or we didn't rank them, but let's do real quick. What would your top 3 Derekk Riggs artwork be?
Number 1, Power Slave.
Uh-huh.
Number 2, it may be the artwork where Eddie's fighting the devil with a hatchet.
That's the single for Sanctuary, I think.
I think it's something off of Number of the Beast, actually.
Or maybe it's a single for Number of the Beast. That's probably what it is.
It might be. I don't know. That's just off the top of my head. I don't know what number 3 would be. Yeah. Maybe some of the Seventh Son art. I don't know. Hard to say.
I think I would go with Live After Death.
Oh yeah.
That's because that's the one where he's ripping out of the ground, out of the cemetery, and he's got the tombstone behind him, and with the H.P. Lovecraft quote on it, and like the lightning is hitting him in the head. The color of that album, like blue and black, it's killer.
Yeah, the color of that art is beautiful.
I had a huge poster of that, like an oversized poster of that. And I walked into my dorm freshman year of college and planted that thing right above my bed, immediately establishing dominance in that room. I'm like, I'm the alpha. I am here. And my roommate was like, long-haired Bob Dylan fan. I was like, take your patchouli, take a hike. Fucking Maiden lives on here. But I think Live After Death is the first one. I think Killers is a great album cover. And yeah, I mean, the single, maybe it was Purgatory then. It was like half the devil face and half of Eddie's face.
Sure, yeah.
Shot. I always liked that. I had a little pin on my jeans jacket in high school. Remember like the square pins that you would get? I had one of those bad boys.
I like the theme that they carry, like that iconography throughout their shirts. So like you might see that image on the back of a different shirt. Like images show up more than once. It's not like you just get the one Iron Maiden shirt with the one image. Like they recreate and repurpose those kind of that kind of iconography. Trick or Treat Studios, who do phenomenal latex masks, are also doing really cool Iron Maiden masks themed off of the albums. It's just really cool. Like when you're a kid, you never imagine that these things are going to become real.
I
Like,
know.
how are you going to have a peace of mind mask that looks like it's right off the album?
When you say that, I almost bought that too because they were at Monster Palooza as well. They had a huge booth. They do everything. And I was like, oh, I got to buy that. But I already had so much shit on me. I was like, I can't take any more in my suitcase. And that was just like it was a numbers game.
You wear it on the plane.
I was like, how do I get this thing home? I came in with like an X budget that I was like, I didn't want to surpass, and I had surpassed it already. And I was like, dude, I'm spending a shit ton of money here. I'm like, I cannot buy. I forget what the price was, but I was like, but it's going to open up a wormhole because I could easily see myself now having like a horror movie mask collection, But this studio is fantastic. These guys are awesome.
Yeah, I really like the Power Slave mask, the Mummy mask.
Yeah.
I think it's cool how that album has two.
That is a great album cover, dude.
Iconic images, like the Mummy with the lightning,
yeah.
Oh, so phenomenal.
The Pharaoh is already such a powerful symbol. So when you combine that with Eddie, another powerful symbol, you're just like, boom, it's killer.
It's almost like they have to be more creative with every album because they have to find a new theme that they haven't experienced before.
Just talking about this, I get so excited to talk about it. This is exactly how I was when I saw Derekk Riggs, dude. I wanted to hug the man, and it's very hard. I think it's funny too because like it's easy to fanboy out like when you see your superstars, and if you ever met any of these musicians, it's a real thing. You get awestruck. I got awestruck by this like frumpy British guy, dude. You know what I mean? I met Derekk Riggs and I was like, dude, you're the man. You don't understand what you've created. And he does understand, but he's super humble and he's just like an average bloke, you know what I mean? Super down to earth. I was like, man, you've created the coolest thing ever. You've created literally the coolest thing ever.
All right. Another thing that I wanted to touch on this episode was our favorite modern era Iron Maiden albums. I mean, Brave New World through Book of Souls. So 2000s to now, the return of Bruce Dickinson, the Blaze Bayley stuff kind of fell flat. I think people really had fallen out and didn't really follow them. There's been 5 albums since Bruce's return. What are your thoughts?
Well, most of my knowledge of these past albums were like really what became popular on Liquid Metal or Sirius XM that I've heard, so I heard Wicker Man, I heard Book of Souls. It was really when you and I started to have this conversation that let's do this, I sat down and said, okay, I'm going to do a little bit of research on this and give these a listen. And I went through them and I liked them. I think that Brave New World and Book of Souls are probably the strongest of the two. Strongest because they're the ones that really have like popular songs that have made somewhat mainstream again for Maiden that they play at a show. Although I think the Final Frontier surprised me. I thought that that one was going to be a little bit of a dud, but I liked that one too. I think that the the Dance of the Dead and a real live one or a real dead one or whatever it's called, Dance of the Dead.
Matter of Life or Death.
Yeah, those didn't nothing super jumped out on me, but I also did not give it the time that it probably deserves. What's interesting, I think, about this conversation is really like, why did I not continue this sort of obsessive Maiden listening habit in the latter half of my life and their career? So, I don't really know. And I actually, it sort of occurred to me. I went for a run this morning and I was listening to the first Maiden album again. And I think what occurred to me was, if you look at the albums that came before these, the last Dickinson albums before the Blaze Bayley years, like No Prayer for a Dying and Fear of the Dark, those albums changed from the earlier years that were starting to get into these like 10-minute epic songs. All of Maiden always had like a journey, and it told like these friggin' novels. Fear the Dark and No Prayer for the Dying went that MTV-ization of metal that happened in that late 80s, 90s era. Same thing with like Seasons in the Abyss, the Black Album. The songs are shorter, they're poppier, they're written so you can have a video, they're written so you can get airtime. That's what happened to Fear the Dark, I think, and to No Prayer for the Dying.
Yeah.
And I think at that time, then my taste started to evolve. Then it was like, you know, vulgar display of power, just owned everything. And then I was just full on thrash at that point. I was big time into Metallica in those years. And if the heavier, the better. So I think naturally Maiden, which always kind of stayed pretty typical to their sound, became less exciting to me. And it was the OG albums that always really sort of were near and dear to me. When I listen to these albums, I'm like, you know what? There's some good tracks on these. They're typical Maiden stuff, you know? So I think it was just more of an evolution of my taste, but it was also like Bruce left, you know, he's gone. Now it's like a girlfriend trying to return again. Like basically the rule is like, you broke up with her for a reason. Usually you don't date her a second time. You know what I mean? So, you know, clearly that wasn't the case. These guys were able to like work through it and make some good albums and some good songs again. And there are some great tracks on this stuff, but I think that's what happened to me was that my music, I just wanted to diversify, and there was now more bands that I was listening to. I wasn't falling for that, you know, hey, I'm an older band you've been listening your whole life, I'm going to try the new stuff. I think that's the only really way I can sort of explain why without really knowing why.
Yeah, I think for me, like when Brave New World came out and Dance of Death, I was still in the phase of listening to the early albums because I had gotten into them later.
Yeah.
So I was like, well, why am I going to spend time on this new stuff? I haven't fully absorbed, you know, the self-titled through Seventh Son of a Seventh Son. To me, the self-titled through Seventh Son is like, those are the best years. You know, No Prayer for Dying. I don't think that's a great album. I think things get muddy and like I too would have like tuned out, I think. So out of the modern era albums, I actually would go with A Matter of Life and Death.
Oh, really?
And that was, I think that's when I was like, okay, I'm going to check out new Iron Maiden now. And when that album came out, I was kind of immersed in that. I mean, I saw Maiden for the first time in 2005. This album comes out in 2006. So,
oh, really?
The timing.
Did they play their full album at that time, or was it one of the nostalgia tours?
It was nostalgia because that was actually their first U.S. tour. That was Ozfest. So that was like their first U.S. tour in like.
I saw that tour because Sabbath headlined that year.
Yeah, many years they hadn't played the U.S. and I know there was some controversy between like Sharon and the Ozzy management and Iron Maiden, basically because Iron Maiden was like blowing it up every night. They were awesome, and it's hard to put Iron Maiden not as a headliner. You know,
Right.
It's tough when you have like Sabbath and Maiden. Like, what are you gonna do? Like, so I think the order made sense, but things happen. But so I think A Matter of Life and Death, and this is like a lot of albums. If you listen to an album and you listen to the whole album and you keep listening to the whole album, you fall in love with the album.
Right.
And I think for me, that's kind of what happened. And I would consider these 5 albums as a different version of the band than the original however many albums, the first 7 albums or whatever. I think there was the original albums, and then there's like the muddy point in the band's career for like, and I would say like for Metallica, a band like Metallica, that'd be like the Load, Reload, Saint Anger era.
Yeah.
And now Metallica's in this back end too, where they're putting out these albums that are great albums. They're not as great, but it's good stuff. You hear it on the radio and you're just happy that Metallica's on the radio. There's a new song by Metallica. There's a new song by Iron Maiden on the radio. This is great. They're playing Iron Maiden. It's something new. Final Frontier came out and I didn't get as into it. It just didn't hit me as it didn't seem as polished as A Matter of Life and Death. And they were really tying it to like this alien thing, the space thing.
Yeah.
Book of Souls, I think it's phenomenal. It's a double album. It should have just been like 9 songs. If they would have taken the 9 best songs on the Book of Souls, threw out the rest, and did an album cover that's Mayan inspired, because it's the whole Mayan theme. And it was like they brought in Mayan experts. They were authentic and accurate as best they could. And did a classic Derekk Riggs album cover like Power Slave, but it's like a Mayan pyramid, and it's like some just phenomenal. If I had that visual and they only used 9 songs, that would have hands down been the one that I picked.
So you wanted them to make a nostalgic album?
No, I think that the good songs on Book of Souls are great, and I think that they hold up. I wanted the visuals to be nostalgic.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because you had mentioned you felt like this character was very Riggs reminiscent, and I think the character is, but I think that the fact that they just put it on a black background,
right.
Like I don't know. I mean, on the other side of things, Dance of Death is the worst album cover I think of all Maiden albums.
Terrible.
And that wasn't that was, I think, in Bruce's book. That wasn't even the final artwork. That was like a rendering to show what it was going to look like, and the band was like, "We love it. Let's use it." So that's why they look like weird, like it looks like 90s CG. It looks
pretty bad digital comp. Yeah.
That album I really don't care for. I think Brave New World, I mean, they've got Wicker Man on there.
Yeah.
And that was The Return. It was exciting. I like that album cover.
I think that there's always what I sort of noticed, right or wrong, and I think I need to give it more listens to in order to really justify the opinion, but I'll say it anyway, is that these later albums seem to me like the writing was more about Bruce finding some like operatic chorus that he could repeat and chant in the middle of the song.
Sure.
Which was always sort of his thing, but I think that that's sort of almost the template that they did on these albums, as opposed to earlier on, there was certainly a riff that was just as important. You know, there wasn't a single track on here. I mean, there's a couple that I jotted down and I was like, okay, this is all right. But there wasn't a single track where it was like the opening to Wasted Years. You know what I mean?
Sure.
So where it just like the guitar comes in and just kicks you in the nuts. And I think that maybe the band, I don't know, is that a thing with the band? They're just getting tired and they're relying on their successful template to write new albums? I don't know. Or is it like the Tool albums, I got to listen to it 30 times before I fucking get it. And then I'm like, okay, you're a fool for thinking this was not good. You know, there are some bands that are like that, you know, so is Maiden like Tool, or really is Tool like Maiden? You know, that's really the way it is. Do you have to listen to these and really absorb it? Probably, because there's a reason why they've been around as long as they are, is because they're on a fucking level that we're not, you know? So
I think you touched on that a little bit too, with the notion of like, hey, I was on to listening to other things. I was into Pantera, whatever. I think people who listen to a band like Iron Maiden, people who listen to a band like Rush or Kiss, there are diehards.
Yeah.
Whereas like we are diehard metalheads, but we like try to listen to all of it, like everything.
Right.
And I mean, I love everything from Rat to Scorpions to Dream Theater to Meshuggah to Ghost. Like it's a very diverse mix of sounds. But I think there's people out there that they're just Iron Maiden fanatics, like they're freaks for this band and they just want to listen to Iron Maiden. So when you get a new album, it's like getting a new Tool album. Like, you know what that feeling is like? You're like, I'm done. I've listened to these Tool albums so much that I'm ready for something new. Like, I am prepared. So I just think that we have other things. There's other new exciting bands that like Maiden isn't in a peak of writing in their career and producing.
Right.
Other bands that we are listening to are in that peak. A band like Gojira is in their peak right now. So they come out with something new. Of course, we're going to be all over it and we're going to listen to the whole thing.
Yeah, I think Maiden is like a really good steady, long relationship that you've been in. You can rely on it. You know, maybe the romance has died a little bit. You know what I mean? You know exactly. You finish each other's sentences. Like it's that. You know. Yeah. Sometimes you're like, hey, I just want to flirt with somebody at the bar real quick. You know what I mean? I don't know. That's probably a really poor analogy that'll get me in trouble down the road. But you know, there's something about, like you just said, like, okay, Gojira new track came out yesterday. I was amped. I was like, okay, let me hear this. You know, so I think really that's what happened when Bruce left. Fear of the Dark, No Prayer for the Dying, not their strongest efforts at the time. You were getting killer metal that was coming at you from all different types of angle. You know, new metal, love it or hate it, was fresh. It was new. It was interesting. Yeah. So a band like Maiden, who is pumping out the same kind of sound, maybe it's time I'm gonna try the different ice cream for a little bit. You know what I mean? I'll probably end up going back to vanilla at that point, but I'm gonna try a different flavor for a little bit. I think that's what happened with me. Now, as we do sort of the nostalgia trip, and you give a reason to go back and listen to it, it forces you to say, hey, you know what? Maybe you shouldn't have broke up with her. She was a good chick. You know, that's the one you had all the time. So I saved it. I tried to bring it back in. You know,
I think to be consistent year after year after year. I mean, they were putting out almost an album a year for 8 years. You know, they're to be consistent, and then you see other bands, and you want to stay on top. So you just evolve, change. Again, I think that Metallica, like the Black Album hits, it's so widely popular. It's on every radio station, and they're like, okay, now we can evolve even more. And it's like, no, you don't realize you just hit the fulcrum where you made heavy metal the biggest thing on the planet.
Right.
You keep pushing it more, you're not going to alienate all your core fans. And Iron Maiden essentially did that. They kept, you know, Adrian leaves. They have 2 more albums with Bruce. They're evolve, and it all kind of falls apart. And just like Metallica, okay, Metallica comes back with Death Magnetic after being gone all this time, trying to be some sort of Led Zeppelin rock and roll band.
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, oh yeah, the fans actually just want our early material.
And it's killer.
We're going to honor our material. I mean, I get it. They're artists. So artists want to evolve. Artists want to do something different. They don't want the same flavor all the time. They want to change, and they want to develop, and they think that their best work is ahead of them without realizing that it may be behind them, and that you can own that. And Iron Maiden's a great example. When they go out and play live, they're honoring all of that old material. They can throw in a new song here and there. And, you know,
but as artists, what these guys will tell you too is that they make these records for themselves, not for the fans. So what you might think is their best work is behind them. What's interesting about art is that, you know, somebody might think your best work is something that you don't like. And that's, you know, as an artist myself too, I'm always shocked about what people gravitate towards, like on the things that I make. I'm like, you like that thing? Really? I'm like, oh, I hate that. But you know, that's why I will never shit on Metallica for making Load and Reload. I think they're great albums. I think if you're the best of the best for 30 years, you better try something different, because otherwise you're going to go fucking nuts. So, you know, any of these bands that decide to try something and then maybe, hey, I'll come back to it, you know, I think that's perfectly acceptable. And I think it's bullshit for us to, you know, criticize these bands and be like, they suck. I'm like, really, dude? What have you done? You've been just sitting on a couch listening to it. Where's your fucking 10 records? You know? So appreciate the catalog. You know, go back and reflect why you're not listening to it. Maybe it's a reflection of you, not them.
Yeah, well, and I think that with any kind of evolution, you're going to lose fans.
Yeah.
And I don't hold it against Metallica, because again, like my Metallica stopped putting out records after the Black Album.
Yeah.
And I respect everything they're doing, and like listening to Hardwired, like listening to that album, I've listened to it a few times.
Yeah.
But like it's just like these Maiden albums, I listened to them a few times, and I'm probably good. But when I want to fix a Maiden, I'm probably not going to listen to these albums.
Right.
But my next question for you is like Maiden and like a band like Rush, they do these album tours and then they go out and they do the full retrospective nostalgia tours.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts on that? Like what would you rather see if you're going to go see Iron Maiden? Are you going to see the album tour or the nostalgia tour?
99% of the time, I'm going to answer nostalgia tour.
Sure.
The only band I think that I'd say I want to see the new album tour is Tool. And that's because they've made us wait 16 years. And I'm like, Maynard's like a religion to me. That is another fucking show. But I think the nostalgia tour, especially for older bands, older fans, look, if you're a new brand and you got 2 records, go out and play your new record. If you've got a catalog of 16, you know that your fans have been listening to you for those 30 years that you pumped them out. Give them what they want, man, because they're paying money to get to see you and go see them. And I think that's what it is. Tool is the only one that I'd say I want the new tour. Also because I've seen them a million times. So I've seen the same show over and over and over again. Maiden, I've only seen Maiden twice. The second of which was on that 05 tour with Ozfest,
Sure.
which lacked the theatrics, the stage theatrics as their normal shows. And then the first time I saw them was a No Prayer for the Dying tour in 89. No, 90, 91, something like that, 91. Anthrax opened for them. Anthrax was on the Persistence of Time tour. And also that stage was somewhat stripped down in comparison to like all the other albums before that. So I'm very much like, if I'm going to see Maiden, I want to see Eddie walk around on stage. I want to see giant fucking airplanes. You know what I mean? I want to see pyramids. I want to see it all. And I want to sing along to, Running Free. That's what I want to say.
Yeah, and I think, your description of Tool is kind of what I was trying to get at before with these people who are like totally geeked out on one specific band.
Right.
Like you are one of those people, but it happens to be Tool.
Right.
So apply that same mentality to somebody else who their tool is Iron Maiden. I think for me, I've seen both. I saw the Book of Souls tour. It was awesome, like to see this like mind themed stage show. And they still do classics in there. And maybe there's points in the show where I'm like, okay, I could probably do with some more hits right now.
Oh, they played the whole album?
They did the album. Yeah. I don't know if they did every track or just a large portion of it, but it was like open with some hits, album, end with hits. And that's the same. I saw Rush that way before the R40 tour, which was that was their last tour ever. And they did the full retrospective. What I will say is that, when you go and you see an album tour, it changes your opinion of that album. So
Sure.
when you see that album tour and then you go see them on the nostalgia tour, when they play a song off that album, you get way more excited because you have a whole new perspective on like the visuals that go with that and the way that they present the material. And if it's 10 years prior that you saw the album tour, you're like, I was there, I was part of that. Like, so I would pick that my favorite thing is the nostalgia tour because I want all the hits. But I also think there's something special, like on this last Tool tour. I agree. Like it's really cool to see all this new material, live. So I'm okay with both. I'd be bummed if bands didn't do full album tours. It's cool when bands go back and revisit an album
when they announce it. Yeah, like you were talking about Korn earlier. Korn played their first album. Did you and I go to that show together? Yeah, right.
Yeah, I saw it twice. I saw it once in Milwaukee and once with you in Oakland.
Dude, when they played that first album, just a few years ago in its entirety, and it takes you back to that time and place, that's killer. I'm all for the full album nostalgia tour. There you go. We hybrid it. That's
yes.
Yeah.
I would prefer that too. Yeah, that's like cool if they went and did like a Peace of Mind.
Yeah, totally.
Tour, like everybody would lose their mind. I don't know how the band would feel. The nice thing about those is like with Korn is they're playing songs they never played before live.
Right. Or haven't played in 2 decades or whatever.
Yeah, I had I'm a huge fan of the band Failure, and going and seeing them play Fantastic Planet front to back, like that's all I need really, because that is the quintessential album and the quintessential material. They have other albums, but none hit as hard as that one album.
Yeah.
So if you wait long enough with a lot of these bands, you get to see them play their instead of and think about like bands that aren't Maiden level, like Rat. Like if they went on an out of the cellar tour, like I would way more want to see that than anything else.
Yeah.
I don't want a new Rat album.
Yeah.
Infestation was a great new Rat album. It was very classic sounding, but like if you could like be transported back in time to see Appetite for Destruction tour, I mean, come on, like I'd lose my mind. Like here's all my money, like take it, play it. A Back in Black tour, like let's do that as the final run with AC/DC, like with Brian Johnson. Like let's go out there and do that. Like
you're seeing it more and more too, though. I think bands, when they realize maybe the end is getting there, or they're just tired, they'll do that, or they need a moneymaker, whatever the reason is. I think you start to see it more and more.
Well, ticket sales, they sell out.
Or you can be like Al Jorgensen. He's like angry at the old shit. He doesn't even want to play it. He yells at the crowd. He basically comes out. He does like two-thirds of it. He does like, a set and a half of all new shit, all his like political stuff. And he goes, this is the old shit that you fuckers want to hear. You know what I mean? Before he goes into, NWO or something like that. And he's like angry that you want to hear his old music.
Yeah.
He's like, he has his agenda and his message. I think that's the extreme of the spectrum. But, certainly you have to consider, what does the artist want to fucking play? Are they sick of playing this music for 40 years?
Sure.
Maybe they are, So I don't know.
Yeah. Another thought with the bands going back and playing old albums, Riot Fest in Chicago, they always get like 8 bands to do one of their seminal albums. And that's really cool because they're usually not on tour. So it's not a tour package to go play that album.
Yeah.
I saw Wu-Tang do 36 Chambers, Rob Zombie doing Astro Creep 2000 live. And they released that on vinyl, then the live version of that. But like, again, talk about quintessential Rob Zombie, like the solo material is great, but if I can see Astro Creep or the Sexorcisto like live, like that album, like again, take all my money. That's all I want to see. And maybe I'm just living in nostalgia land, but and maybe this is for another podcast, but for a lot of bands, especially when it comes to like 80s glam bands, it's like 2 albums and I'm out. Like when they got really big on the radio, I didn't want any part of the pop version of Def Leppard. But those first 3 albums on Through the Night, like a lot of those bands, it's just 2 albums and I'm out of there. And we can't even have this discussion about the later material.
It's a hard discussion in generalize too, because the level of the bands are so different. Where they're at now, like if you look at Dickinson, who's been doing it for long, and everybody, he's still in great shape. He comes out, his energy level is super high. But then, do you really want to go see fat Vince Neil? You know what I mean? Barely sing, fucking, shout at the devil. You know what I mean? It's hard to swallow that, even though you want that nostalgia, because you're like, I want skinny Vince Neil to come out here and do this. But no, dude, So for Maiden, they're at another level, and I think that's something that we have to recognize and appreciate. And I think the reason why we chose them really as this discussion first is because they really deserve to be where they're at, which is, on a level that most bands just do not get to. So if they want to come out and play a full album, you're going to know it ahead of time. Chances are they're going to have a tour the following year if you don't want to see that, where you can get the nostalgia.
Yeah, I just saw they just announced Legacy of the Beast, I think European dates for 2021. Like that tour is a nostalgia tour, and I saw it in Massachusetts last summer. Phenomenal gig. The big bomber plane comes out on the intro, and the inflatable Eddie and all this stuff. It was like more than you could ever ask for. I think they're going to be on that tour for a few years here. And you always get a chance to see, like, you can just skip the album tour. Like, that's as easy as it is. It's
Exactly.
they're always on tour. It's not a band that, like, if you don't go, you're not going to get a chance to see them. So, and sometimes it's like, okay, like, just to hear the 8 hits you'll hear along with the album might be worth it for that, to justify that ticket price anyways.
Yeah, usually the new song they play, that's when you go to the bathroom. That's like that's sort of like the unwritten rule. We need a pee break.
So where do you see Iron Maiden headed now into the future?
Well, I think that assuming everybody's healthy, I don't see them stopping. Will I freak out when the new album drops again? I'll probably give it a listen to it now, since we've sort of revisited this in our lives. But the way that I look at it is, if these guys are going to go out on the road and put the effort in to make new music and go and tour, there's no reason why I can't put the effort in to go buy a ticket and see them.
Exactly.
But as a concert goer who has gone to so many concerts that I can't remember, I'm actually embarrassed to say I've only been to 2 Maiden shows. I thought that I had been to more Maiden shows.
Sure.
But I had to go through like every memory, because I'm like, I know this band so well, and but I've only seen them twice. So now I'm like, I want to see a fucking nostalgia tour, like, right now. So if the world ever heals and concerts become a thing again, that should be like our annual travel trip. Let's see a Maiden show together.
Well, that's something I should mention too. I mean, for people listening, I mentioned Ken's a concert travel partner of mine. Every year we kind of plan a destination concert, and we hit somewhere in the US. We haven't gone international yet. But it's fun to go see bands outside of your local territory, and especially if it's something special like a reunion show, or we saw Tool out in the desert. That was pretty cool.
Saw the Misfits in Jersey.
Yep.
For the first and only time in like 20 years.
Rammstein.
Yeah.
But I think the same thing, though. I think they're going to keep going. I think they're going to keep probably on the same speed of putting out albums if they can. I think a really nice thing about Iron Maiden is you still have this classic lineup, and they're still all healthy and running around the stage. I start to feel a little weird when I see a band like Judas Priest. Like, I love Judas Priest and I love the material and I love Rob Halford, but when I know that, that isn't the classic lineup, and now you've got 2 brand new guitarists in the band, it doesn't have the same impact of the history.
A band like that, where like sort of the dueling guitars was such a important part of their sound,
Even seeing Slayer without Jeff Hanneman, and then later without Lombardo, like, for me, with no Lombardo, really killed it for me. I saw the final tour twice because it's Slayer, and I love them, but
even
like
with Gary Holt, no schlub off the street, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I love Exodus, I love Gary Holt, but I mean, and Bostoff's great on drums, but Lombardo brought something special to the mix, and Hanneman equally brought something special to that mix that is lost.
Yeah.
So it just feels weird. So like to have a band like Maiden out there, or like Aerosmith out there doing it with those original guys at that level. Think how much money Van Halen would be making if they could just keep their original lineup together.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I think they'll keep on this trajectory. I don't want to see any band end up into obscurity with a terrible lineup and not putting out a quality product. Even bands with replacements, Judas Priest, their show kicks ass. It's awesome. Yeah. They're doing a great job. I'm going to buy the tickets. I'm going to go to the show. My biggest fear is all of my favorite bands are going to go away.
Gaining. One day you're going to wake up and Ozzy's going to be dead. You know what I mean? That's going to happen. It's shocking that it hasn't. to be honest with you.
Yeah,
Now
I mean,
dumb reality show right now. So
I'm only a few years away from having seen Black Sabbath for the final time, and the notion of never seeing Sabbath again, or never seeing Ozzy again, never seeing Iron Maiden, even something that people might think silly like Whitesnake. Like I went and saw Whitesnake last year, and it was killer, and I loved it, and they played all the classic material. And the thought of not being able to go see David Coverdale talk between songs on stage is like, it just destroys my heart to know that, like, it's not that there aren't good rock bands or metal bands out there, but they're not the same. Like Lamb of God is like, they're waving that metal flag, and they're, like the new Slayer or the new Pantera, they're at that level, but they're not Slayer or Pantera. So I know that I have them to rely on. I know I have a band like Hatebreed to rely on, but they're more aggressive bands. How long can they do it for? The melodic bands that I truly love, like Iron Maiden or Judas Priest, Kiss, Rush is done. Like these are all my favorite bands that are. It's funny, when I was younger, I would see a lot of concerts, and now in my progressed age here, all my tickets is like, how close can I get to see the classic bands?
right.
Like before I can't see them anymore. Aerosmith did a residency out in Springfield, Massachusetts, and we went and saw them, and it's like, how close can we get to Aerosmith? Because there's going to be a day when we wake up and they're not going to be a band anymore. They're not going to be a lot, maybe even on Earth anymore. And yeah, they're not the Aerosmith of the past, but just getting to see them because I might never be able to see them again.
Yeah.
It's just a really weird place to be.
When inevitably, sometimes you see that coming, so you get a chance to see them too. But then also, you have to recognize that's just the cycle of life, and older bands are gonna fade. And as we get older, it's important then that maybe we start listening to younger bands. Like a buddy we went into San Francisco and we saw Alien Weaponry. These kids are teenagers from New Zealand. I don't know if you know them. They came out. It was a tiny little club. We went in there. It was like no cover charge, or the tickets were cheap. I don't know, man. So we had a couple drinks and these kids came out 16 years old and killed it. And then they came out and we're talking to the crowd, and I was like, dude, the path that you're on right now, take it as an old metalhead fan. You're doing great. You're representing, you know what I mean? So inevitably there comes like a passing of the torch thing. And that's like, these bands are going to end. We're going to end, it's like we do this podcast. So hopefully my son, who's about to be 5 in September, listens to this at some point and says, you know what, Dad, now that I've been listening to Maiden for 15 years, I can disagree with your comment about, Number of the Beast being the best album, so that's just a part of life, is just that aging, the maturation, that, withering away, go out and see what you can, but embrace the new too. You've got the Lamb of Gods and the Gojiras, and, there's a new wave of metal that exists and always will exist. So, you just wave a different flag sometimes.
Yeah, I think Gojira is a good one to mention. I think about, I saw them on a Size stage at Chicago Open Air. They were like the last band to play of the day. They played extra songs. It just completely blew my mind and made me a lifelong fan. With very little like background other than hearing Randy Blythe say like, my new favorite band is from France and they're called Gojira. It kind of puts in perspective like what it would have been like to see Iron Maiden in a small club back in the day, and then see their evolution to where they become, or seeing a band like Slipknot on a small stage and now seeing them selling out amphitheaters and stadiums.
Dude, that Ozfest when Maiden played in 2005, Mudvayne, White Zombie, just to name a few that were on the second stage. So, those bands now that are those small guys, they're going to be big, those are going to be our kids' big bands. That's just how it goes. So
I would just urge anyone anyone out there that's like, I'll wait till the next tour, to just consider that there might not be a next tour, especially with these legends. They're not hurting. They're not like, if you don't buy a ticket, they're still going to sell out. Like, they're going to do just fine without you. I think it's important to give back to the bands that mean so much in your life. But I've had so many friends that are like, oh, I'd love to see Slayer someday. And it's like, guess what, buddy? There is no Slayer now.
Right.
Like you put it off, you put it off, you put it off. On the flip side, I've been to a lot of final tours that don't become final tours.
Yeah.
So
I've been to many Ozzy retirement tours, man.
Yeah, same. I went to the Kiss tour, final tour twice. I went to the Slayer final tour twice. I'm debating trying to get the Madison Square Garden tickets for the final Kiss show. It's just like these historical things. You never know when things are going to end. And also, like, looking at like the last 5 albums, the album that came out in 2000, Brave New World, that's now 20 years old. Like, it seems like, oh, that's the new material.
Yeah.
But it puts it in perspective how much has gone on. All right, Ken, this is the final segment of the podcast, the Firing Squad. In this segment, I'll be asking our guests 10 quick-fire questions. Ken hasn't seen this list of questions prior to me asking them, so his answer should be quick and simple with no explanation needed. Ken, are you ready?
I am.
All right. Number 1, what is your all-time favorite movie?
Oh, shit. Ghostbusters. The original, obviously.
Oh, yeah, obviously.
Yeah.
Number 2, favorite childhood toy or toy line?
It's probably going to be both. It's G.I. Joe versus Star Wars. I had them pitted against each other. G.I. Joe, if I absolutely had to make a decision.
All right. Speaking of Star Wars, what is your favorite Star Wars film?
Empire.
Number 4, your favorite band?
All time?
Just say Tool.
Right now, Tool.
Number 5, favorite current series to DVR stream binge?
Actually, I'm watching a documentary on the Golden State Killer, also known as the East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker on HBO. It's really good.
Ear ons.
Yeah,
we're like 4 episodes into that.
Yeah, that's fucking great right now. I'm into that shit.
Pretty depressing though. Pretty depressing story. Not the crime part, but the rest of it.
Well, just all of it, man. All of it. The lack of police engagement is really just ridiculous. But
number 6, Ozzy Sabbath or Dio Sabbath?
No question. Ozzy.
All right. Number 7, DC or Marvel?
Marvel.
Number 8, favorite bass player?
I guess I got to go with Cliff Burton.
Nice. Yeah. Number 9, favorite comic book villain?
Venom, I guess.
All right. Number 10, our final question. Your favorite member of Metallica not named Lars?
James Hetfield is probably the greatest frontman ever.
All right, Ken, before we wrap this up and get out of here, do you have anything you'd like to plug? Where can people find out about your skull art?
Yeah. I've got a pretty small Instagram account called Sculpable. I'm just starting to get some things I've been working on off the ground. Sculpable, SKULLAPBLE. A lot of the artists that I follow have sort of inspired me to make my own skulls. So this is like quarantine edition pinhead skull that I had created. I made a mold and I cast these out of resin. And I just finished this one up last night, which is a new sort of NFL themed helmet skulls. So this one, I had to teach myself how to weld. So
Very
I'm
cool.
proud of myself, and looking to try to figure out a way that I can replicate them and sell them. Sculptable, SKULLPABLE.
Very cool. And I'll share that on our social as well,
Right on,
so
dude.
people can check it out. Another thing to remember for those listening, this is streaming live on YouTube right now. It'll be there to listen to as many times as you want after this. As of Monday, we should be on all streaming audio platforms. So the audio version will also be on Spotify, Google, Apple Podcast app, etc. So check us out. Tell your friends. Ken, sincerely, thank you, brother, for being part of this historical episode of the Collect and Destroy podcast. We plan to have you on again. There's so many ways we can go.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for allowing me to walk down memory lane with you, man. I had a blast doing this.
Everyone stay safe out there, and we'll catch you on the next episode. We're going to be sitting down to talk all things Indiana Jones with our good friend Nate Failhour. Thank you and good night.